Right now on Discovery Channel, Rik Mayall investigates the role of violence in our ancestors' lives and looks at how it was used to repress the poor in Tudor England. It's Violent Nation.
The headlines we see scream about yob culture, gang war and domestic violence. I mean, you'd be forgiven for thinking that we live in violent times. But are we really any more violent than we've ever been? Or is the truth a bit more complicated? Has violence shaped the people that we are today?
Over the last 2,000 years, the British people have been hitting, beating and killing each other in all sorts of nasty ways. From the cradle to the grave, violence has been a fact of life for us lovely, civilised British. But why did violence play such a big part in the everyday lives of our ancestors? How did it shape the society in which they lived? But before we get all high and mighty about this, what about us? Would we, us 21st centuryists, be as violent as our ancestors if we didn't have laws to stop us?
For most of our history, Britain has pretty much been a free-for-all, based on wealth and might, and laws were passed to benefit the powerful. Ordinary folk were expected to know their place and stay there.
Shut up.
The chief instrument for keeping everyone in their place was violence, and no one was exempt. Men, women, or children.
Let's talk about violence against men. Today, in Britain, your average man has only got a 1 in 20 chance of being a victim of violent crime. But things were very different in Tudor times. Travel back to the 15th or 16th centuries, and you're 5 times more likely to die a violent death than today. And you had a strong chance of getting a good kicking from your local lord, or being flogged senseless by your employer. And ordinary Tudor men would more than likely get into a fight with each other within minutes of leaving their front doors. Why was that? The Tudors had a very complicated system of being violent to each other, and it was all to do with status. Let me tell you a real story. This actually happened.
In 1523, the Viscount of Kells, a man of very high status, known personally to the king, was driving along the King's Highway when all of a sudden, you won't believe this, there was a common peasant, a rustic type, in his way.
So the Viscount got out of his carriage and he went up to the bloke and gave him a bloody good severe beating up with his cane until the frightful little inbred country type came around to his point of view about whose right of way it was. And after giving him the beating he so richly deserved, the man died. This was a bit awkward. Even in those days, you couldn't just wander around killing people. And the Viscount was brought before the House of Lords under a charge of murder. Not a problem for our Viscount, though. He told the king that it wasn't his fault. He was merely retaliating to the fact that a peasant had got in his way and wouldn't get out of his way. Well, the king was shocked. This was, and I quote, a frightful affront. It was very, very great provocation and downright insolence. So the king pardoned him, and quite right too.
But violence wasn't confined to the landed gentry. It ran through the whole of male society.
Violence was woven into daily interactions. It was a very important part of upholding hierarchies and confirming status in the early modern period. There are some forms of violence, like, say, slapping someone on the face, that if a master did to his servant wouldn't be considered violence. But if the servant did that to his master, that would be really very shocking.
Right.
Hierarchy was incredibly important, and this is a society where there's no police force. You're relying on amateurs in roles of constable and so on at the local level, and the way that order is maintained is through associating authority with status, with everybody knowing their place and staying in that place.
It's a kind of society's language. It doesn't matter what class you are. Everybody understands this language and they behave by its rules.
Yeah.
The Tudors lived in an extremely violent time in British history, and they used violence to maintain the pecking order of the day. Rich men would beat up poor men, titled men would beat up commoners, older men would beat up younger men. But what if you're a man at the very bottom of the pile? Who did you get to pick on? The only place where you were lord and master was in your own home. And after a hard day waiting on his lordship at the castle and being beaten with a stick, the one compensation you had was to knock the living daylights out of your wife. British society's attitudes towards women are constantly changing. In the past, violence towards women wasn't just approved, it was even endorsed. Did you know the Romans were actually allowed to kill their wives just for drinking alcohol? And the Anglo-Saxons used to cut off their wives' noses and ears for committing adultery. And the 6th century Christian church told women that getting a thrashing from their man was actually good for them, because a woman's ability to endure violence was a sign of a virtuous wife and a good Christian. So all you had to do was to get beaten up by your husband, not complain about it, and you could go to heaven. Women didn't get much better treatment from the state either. When Henry II came to power in 1154, he created for the first time ever a formal legal system for Britain. The common law was written for the people, stating that legally a man's wife was his possession. Men had the right to beat their wives, so long as they did it what was called moderately and reasonably, which actually meant that basically you could do anything you wanted to her, as long as you didn't murder her. That was a crime. And if a woman complained about this state of affairs, she didn't get very far. In 1396, in York, a poor woman called Margaret Neffield decided to attempt the rare and brave step of dissolving her marriage on the grounds of cruelty. And although her husband Thomas did admit that, yes, he had beaten her up, rather a lot, and yes, he had broken her arm. Zzz. And yes, he had slashed her around a bit, well, a lot, with a knife and things. But the court decided that no, Margaret did not have a case. She didn't have a case. And not only that, the court advised Thomas to beat her up even more, to correct her faults. When women complained about violence, they got no protection from the law. And medieval man had some very clever devices and contraptions up his sleeve to keep a woman in her place. Violence has been a part of British people's lives for thousands of years. But there are some members of our society who have had more than their fair share of a good kicking. Take the position of women in the Middle Ages. The state gave each village the authority to punish women who didn't toe the line. Any woman who gossiped too much, any woman who nagged too much, any woman who caused trouble, or really any unpopular woman could be punished for any reason they felt like. And this person was known as a scold. A scold was a troublesome and angry woman who by her wrangling amongst her neighbours doth break the public peace and beget, cherish and increase public discord. These days, of course, we put women like that on daytime discussion shows. But in those days, they put their head inside one of these.
the scold's bridle.
The scold's bridle was first seen in Edinburgh in 1567, but it soon spread south over the border. Basically, it was an iron frame which fitted onto the unpopular woman's head and was padlocked on the back, so only the key holder could get it off. It had a piece of iron called a tongue, which rammed into the mouth and stopped the woman talking.
And once the scold's bridle was on, are you ready, Christy?
Christy Colley is an amateur historian from Leominster, and she's volunteered to play the role of my nagging wife to get the feel of what it was really like for medieval women.
The woman was then paraded around the town so that all the townsfolk could see how bad she was.
Often, the charge of being a scold was actually brought by the woman's husband. It was a perfect way to humiliate her into submission and boost his own image at the same time. Sometimes she was chained to a hook outside her house, someone else's house, the pub, anywhere really, so that all the town could show their disapproval. And in fact, the crime of being a scold was only abolished in 1967.
There. So you enjoy that? What did it feel like?
Very humiliating. I couldn't speak, my jaw aches, my teeth are numb, my head feels heavy from the weight of the thing.
Yeah.
And just, I gave up wanting to speak because no one could understand me, so I just gave up in the end.
So it did its job?
Yeah, pretty much, yeah.
It shut someone up and made them feel...
Taming the shrew.
Yeah. So what do you think it must have felt like to be a medieval lady wandering around like that?
I wouldn't expect to be treated as well as I have today.
How do you mean?
Well, I've heard that they were treated quite badly.
And this is an original?
This is one of the more pleasant ones, though.
Yeah?
Yeah, it's very, very uncomfortable, but I've seen much more worse varieties than this.
Like what?
The spikes through the tongue is pretty horrendous.
To
serrate the tongue, basically, so they couldn't speak, to form the tongue. They couldn't speak.
So if they tried to speak, it's cut the tongue,
Yeah.
roof of the mouth.
Yeah.
Gee.
Nasty stuff.
So there were spikes on the tongue and other bits of spikes around here too?
Yeah, more often than not, the face was almost fully covered.
Yeah.
Apart from the eyes. I found it difficult to see in front of me because of this.
Yeah.
But also they had spikes at either side, so they cut the neck or they couldn't lie down or find any comfort.
This is serious. This is not funny.
If they survived at all.
How do you mean?
They were often beaten and berated, smeared with poo. People threw slops over them through town.
It was really a big thing.
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
They put one of these on, they might rip their tongue. They tied them to a wall and smeared excrement on them. Beat them.
Beat them. If they survived the dragging through town, they probably wouldn't survive the beating. Often fatal. But I think probably dogs were given a better deal than women back then.
Well, possibly so.
Yeah.
Well, in those days, Britain was a big country. But for whatever the reason, the scold's bridles were more popular in the north of England than in the south. In fact, the city of Chester even had to give a helping hand to Walton-on-Thames to help them to punish their women. They sent a scold's bridle to the southerners with the inscription, "Chester presents Walton with a bridle to curb women's tongues which talk too idle."
But southern men had their own ideas on how in their place, and so they invented the ducking stool. This was a contraption designed to lower a scold into a river and cool her temper. The first ducking stool was built in Cologne, Wiltshire in 1401, and the practice quickly caught on. Female humiliation and DIY, an irresistible combination for medieval man.
Incredibly, the ducking stool was used right up to the 19th century. In fact, the last ever official ducking took place right here in Leominster in 1817. That's less than 200 years ago. While Beethoven is composing his 9th Symphony, folks in Leominster are dishing out medieval punishments to unruly women. So, Eric, this is the original ducking stool.
Yes.
How did this thing work?
Well, the lady would be loaded into the chair and then lifted up right into the air as far as it would go.
With this beam here?
With the beam here, with it just pivoted in the middle.
Right.
Like a seesaw.
Yes.
And then she'd be wheeled around the town.
tell me, what sort of women used to get punished by this machine?
Well, they were defined as shrews, scolds and brawling women.
Brawling women?
Yes.
OK.
But I always think of them as the neighbours from hell. And one of the brawling women, we actually have a first-hand account of her ducking.
All right.
And that was a lady called Jenny Pipes.
Jenny Pipes, the brawling woman?
Yes. And apparently when she came out of the water and was released from the chair, the first words she uttered was swearing at the magistrates for condemning her to such an indignity.
So the brawling woman is put in the machine and she goes down under the water and she comes out brawling. What a fantastic piece of equipment. It's so useless. Yeah. The very last person to be sentenced as a scold in Britain was a lady called Sarah Leek, here in Leominster in Herefordshire. Sarah was taken to the town square and strapped tightly into the ducking stool. She must have been terrified. A crowd of locals taunting her, spitting in her face, beating her with sticks. She's hoisted high up into the air and paraded through the town with all the other women laughing at her as she passes. And they reach the riverbank and the sentence is announced. And herein the ducking stool, the woman is to sit and to be let down into the water 3 or 4 times overhead and ears so that no part of her can be above the water. Sarah sits precariously far out over the bank, waiting for the moment when she plunges backwards into the cold river and the icy water envelops her face and fills her lungs. Except that they didn't duck her, really. Well, at all, really, because the river was too low. There was only about 6 inches of water there, apparently. So everyone just kind of stood around silently, feeling a bit stupid, and wandered off, feeling like complete idiots. So, Sarah Leek was lucky-ish, but for hundreds of years, many women had pretty violent lives. Violent and crap. They had almost no rights, little or no sympathy from their menfolk, and if they did speak up for themselves, then they were dunked repeatedly into a river until they shut up. And then they probably got beaten up by their husbands when they got home, just for good measure. And things didn't get any better in Victorian times either. Behind the closed doors of respectable Victorian homes, women of all classes were beaten and brutalised, and worse. Before 1870, a woman couldn't divorce her husband for reasons of violence. Didn't the law protect women? Well, no. You see, when a Victorian woman got married, everything she owned became her new husband's property. And this meant that if an offence was committed against her, only he could prosecute. And if he'd just beaten her up, he wasn't very likely to do that, was he? It was only at the beginning of the 20th century that women started to seriously campaign for equal rights. And then it took nearly 20 years of protests, marches and hunger strikes by the suffragettes before they finally won the vote in 1918. But even after this, attitudes within the home had hardly changed at all.
50 years ago, there was no collection of information about domestic violence. Most women didn't talk about what was it they were experiencing. Yeah. If people did know about it, it was sort of accepted and tolerated. What happened, you know, after the war was that we had a series of social changes which created an opportunity for women to get out of abusive situations. Yeah. So by the 1960s, by the 1970s, we'd seen, you know, the introduction of the welfare state system, family allowances, changes in divorce law, so a whole raft of things, coupled with the rise of the women's liberation movement, which started to say, you know, look at women's position economically, socially, politically, and start to try and do something about it.
British domestic violence hasn't completely gone away, but at least being abusive in the home isn't acceptable anymore. It's no longer something women have to just put up with. The problem with violence is that when it's used as a tool of social order, it affects everyone. There's a ripple effect with violence which leaves no one untouched, particularly the most vulnerable. In 1822, Martin's Act, the world's first piece of legislation for animal welfare, was passed in Parliament, making it illegal to wantonly and cruelly beat or ill-treat any horse,
mare, gelding, mule, ass, cow, heifer, steer, sheep or other cattle. What you were allowed to ill-treat, though, if you felt like it, is one of these. It wasn't for another 20 years that similar legislation to protect children was made law. In fact, for the price of a horse like this in 1825, you could purchase 3 of these from an orphanage. By the beginning of the 19th century, the empire was growing, the Industrial Revolution was at its height, and the demand for labour was insatiable. A shortage of workers meant that factory owners decided to buy children from orphanages and workhouses for even cheaper labour. The mill owners used to treat children as their effective slaves, often putting them in manacles to stop them running away. A girl called Sarah Carpenter, who worked in the Derbyshire mills, described her brutal existence.
The master started beating me with a stick over the head till it was full of lumps and bled. My head was so bad that I could not sleep for a long time, and I've never been a sound sleeper since. There was a young woman, Sarah Goodling, who was poorly, and so she stopped her machine. James Birch, the overlooker, knocked her to the floor. She got up as well as she could. He knocked her down again. Then she was carried to the apprentice house. Her bedfellow found her dead, in bed. There was another called Mary. She knocked her food can down on the floor. The master, Mr. Newton, kicked her where he should not do, and it caused her to wear away till she died. There was another, Caroline Thompson. They beat her till she went out of her mind.
The smallest children were employed as what were called scavengers. What they had to do was to pick up the spare pieces of cotton from the floor under the machines. But the machines were on, and the children were terrified, half choking on the dust and crawling just inches away from fast, noisy machinery. Some children were scalped when their hair was caught in the machines. Their fingers, their hands and their limbs were regularly crushed. In 1842, a German visitor wrote that he had seen so many people in the streets of Manchester without arms and legs that it was like living in the midst of an army that had just returned from a campaign.
Children were literally treated as expendable commodities, easy to control and cheap to replace. Eventually, in 1832, an MP, Michael Sadler, introduced a bill in Parliament proposing a 10-hour working day for children under 18. But the bill failed, largely due to opposition from mill-owning MPs, and the brutal treatment of children continued for almost half a century. Children under 10 weren't finally banned from working in factories until 1878.
Today, quite rightfully, we're horrified at the way children were treated during the Industrial Revolution. But what is it about us that we're still convinced that violence is the only way of keeping children under control? Nowadays, we think it's wrong to hit another man or beat our wives, but when it comes to kids, somehow it seems all right. Because there is one part of our violent, murky past which many of us would like to return to.
Terrible little brats. Spoiled. They run riot. There's not a lot of discipline. No discipline, yeah.
Sadly, the children aren't taught morals, guidance or anything.
They do whatever they want to. Parents don't have that much control as they had in the past.
Parents just throw money or sweets at them to keep them quiet.
Discipline is going right out of the door.
If that is the case, what should be done about it? Should we bring back physical punishment in schools?
Yes.
I think they should, yeah.
Yeah, I think...
You think it should come back?
Yeah.
Probably the public schools, yeah, they should have it, definitely.
You should?
Yeah.
Yeah, canes a lot.
Although violence in some senses now is frowned upon towards children, there's still an undercurrent where we apply kind of a different criteria when we talk about children from the way we would if we were talking about women or the disabled or other groups. So that children in some senses, I think, are still, as it were, at the bottom of the pile.
Throughout British history, and right up until the end of the 20th century, school children were physically punished, often with one of these.
And this is a prep school cane. The manufacturer's catalogue from the 1960s said this: with a diameter of 1/4 inch and a length of 30 inches, this cane is recommended for the punishment of younger boys, those aged from 7 to 11. It is usually applied to the boy's clothed seat, but is also suitable for application to the palm of the hand. In which case it is guaranteed to prove effective with offenders of all ages.
What's the worst that can happen when a schoolmaster decides a child needs to be punished? 6 of the best and a sore bottom? Well, no. The worst that can happen is that the school kid ends up dead. Britain has a history of violence. Violence against the vulnerable, violence against women, and violence against children. Up until 6 years ago, we could do this to our school children. Some teachers would even take a run-up before administering the blow.
In the 19th century, the growth in world trade meant that rattan could be imported cheaply from the Far East. And with this combination of strength and flexibility, rattan was the perfect material to hurt small children with.
The force of the stroke was concentrated into small areas of flesh, causing a burning pain and usually leaving a series of raised red marks.
And after 4, 6, or sometimes even 12 strokes, the punishment would be over. Except at some schools, where the pupils had to say thank you afterwards, or they'd receive another stroke for impertinence.
But what was it like to be on the receiving end of the cane? And did it actually have any positive effect?
Throughout my schooling period, corporal punishment was very much the norm throughout my primary school and my secondary school. When I look back, I don't think we did anything that was particularly sort of bad in terms of deserving the kind of, you know, punishment that was sometimes inflicted. But we had teachers who just seemed to enjoy inflicting pain on little children. I don't know the logic behind inflicting pain on young people. It doesn't, you know, to me, it doesn't work. It only ever has a negative effect. The best teachers that we had were the ones who were very strict disciplinarians, but it didn't involve violence.
Really?
Absolutely. I left for school with very few qualifications, but the qualifications that I did get were all taught by teachers that didn't used to hit us. They were all teachers that knew how to teach. They were all teachers who knew how to lay down boundaries, and you just knew you didn't cross those boundaries.
But it wasn't just the cane that was used. This was the tawse. This was the slipper. And this is the birch. The birch was used at many of Britain's finest public schools, including Eton, where they even had a special wooden block made for boys to bend over. Good, solid, character-building stuff. Or was it?
There were some cases where teachers just didn't know where to stop.
One example in 1909 was where a schoolboy had broken a school rule in relation to a sport event, and the headmaster of this school punished this pupil by stripping the boy naked, having him run around a swimming pool 20 times, and then beating the boy with a hose. And he beat
with a hose?
With a hose. And he beat the boy so hard that the boy died from his injuries.
He was beaten to death?
Yes, and when this case came to court, the court held that this was an example of a reasonable form of corporal punishment, and therefore it was not illegal.
That was reasonable? Beating a child to death was reasonable?
Yes.
When did this begin to come to a stop?
Two Scottish ladies started a case in 1979 in which their sons were threatened with the use of a toss in their schools. And the parents did not want their children to be punished in this manner, so withdrew them from the schools. And so these boys were at home and not receiving any education. So their case ended up in the European Court of Human Rights. And the European Court of Human Rights held that the parents were entitled to have their convictions respected. The only practical option was to abolish corporal punishment from all state schools.
This was down to the two mums?
Yes, Mrs. Cossins and Mrs. Campbell.
A nice one.
Yes.
Corporal punishment was actually banned in state schools in 1987 and in public schools in 1999. However, outside the classroom, it is still legal to hit your child, so long as you call it smacking. Last year, the government changed the law so that the parents are only allowed to smack their kids if they think it's reasonable punishment. The question is, what is reasonable? For more than 20 years, Cambridge academic Dr. Dorothy Rowe has been Britain's leading expert in child psychology. Her findings on smacking are very clear.
The first thing that happens to a child when smacked is that the child feels pain, and then there'll be a terrible shock that the person you look up to, the person who's supposed to look after you and love you, is inflicting this pain on you. And there are two main ways in which we can defend against the trauma that we've suffered. One way is to say to yourself, well, really it wasn't that my parent was bad and bad to hit me. The truth was, I'm a bad child and I deserve to be hit by my good parent. Now, the other way of interpreting the pain and the fear of the hit is to say to yourself, I'm not scared, it didn't hurt me. So they try to distance themselves from their pain and their fear. But the effect of that is that they lose the capacity for empathy, and that enables you to see other people as objects that you can treat cruelly. And that's the way in which cruelty gets handed down from one generation to another.
If violence breeds violence, what would happen if hitting children was banned? Would that make a difference?
In 1970, Sweden changed the law which said parents were not allowed to use physical means of punishment against their children. And the long-term research since then shows that while in this country something like 75 or 80 children every year die at the hands of an adult, more than one a week, and the adult is usually the parent. In Sweden, there haven't been any such child deaths. There's also big differences in the number of teenagers involved in drugs and crime.
A person's upbringing can clearly have an effect on how violent that person can become, but not everyone who came up the hard way ends up being a violent person. So is there something else going on? Could it be something about our fundamental genetic makeup? Professor Ian Craig of King's College London has been studying human DNA, looking for clues about how our innate genetic structures influence how violent we are.
Is there a violent gene?
Well, there's no such thing as a violent gene. I think we have to
It doesn't have its own name, is that?
Well, there are several genes, all of which contribute a little bit to the violent predisposition. But one of those genes is called monoamine oxidase. And the thing about monoamine oxidase, there are two versions of this gene. Yeah. There's a high-activity gene and a low-activity version of the gene. Right. If you've got a high-activity version, it tends to protect you against the bad environment. If you have the low-activity, then you're more likely to be influenced in the way that the violent an abusive upbringing may lead to an aggressive individual.
Our genes control our reactions to violent situations. But most importantly, they restrain us from excessive or inappropriate violent responses. What happens when people inherit the version of the gene that doesn't hold back their impulse to violence?
There's a family in Holland who, the males of the family actually have a deficient version of the gene. It doesn't work at all.
Yeah.
And all these males have been convicted of various violent crimes, and it segregates just with the males in the family.
But it's not as simple as that. The environment, the way we are brought up, and the society we live in all affect the way that our genes work.
Monoamine oxidase is a player in the game, but it's a very small player, if you like.
So we're not saying that there's a kind of predestination, you're born.
Not at all. Not
the
at all.
rapist. You're born
exactly.
the murderer, or born the vicar.
Exactly.
That is not the case.
That is definitely not the case.
Yeah.
Bad environment can lead and overrule genetic effects and lead individuals to become violent if they're very badly treated themselves. I mean, you can imagine a child who's left on their own and every time they meet somebody they're beaten up, then they're going to believe that's the way life is supposed to be run. There are predispositions and there are environmental influences. You have to mix the whole lot together and you get an outcome.
If there is a potentially violent component to us all, surely there must be some evolutionary reason for all this latent aggression simmering away within. Professor Simon Moore is a psychologist whose special subject is aggression.
Aggression is certainly a useful tool for humans. From an evolutionary perspective, we're programmed to protect our resources because that's part of survival. We're programmed to protect our kin because they share our genes. So the aggressiveness, or the aggressiveness that we use in terms of violence, is used to kind of support our present kind of livelihood.
The fight or flight instinct helps us to cope with unpredictable situations. All very well for the caveman, but what about the modern man? We don't have the same use for violence, but these violent responses do still exist in us, even when there's no real threat. Scientists at London Metropolitan University have been running a series of tests that study people's biological response to shoot-'em-up video games.
I was playing a computer game, which is challenging. It's something you have to actively participate in. You've got to actually engage in the game, but it's not threatening. However badly Owen plays, he's not going to get in any physical danger here. He's not actually going to get hurt. So there's no real threat to Owen. And then we're going to look to see how the body responds to this. Well, what we're seeing is Owen's heartbeat increasing. His adrenaline levels are higher. His cortisol levels may be higher. Adrenaline, sugar being put into the bloodstream, directed to the muscles. It will even alter the way he thinks, to focus his mind onto the game that he's playing, onto the event that he's engaging in. And he'll be taking in much less information from the surrounding environment. So even though this is a non-threatening situation, his body is responding in a way which is going to provide him with energy, optimising him to fight or flight. It's there, or at least it would have been there in our evolutionary environment, because if you don't know what the future holds, it's probably best to be energised, be physiologically aroused. You don't know whether nothing's going to happen, or you're going to get punched, or you may be forced to run away. So if you don't know what's going to happen, your body seems to respond by energising you, giving you the ability to deal with a range of situations.
Good or bad, it seems that violence is intrinsically part of not only who we were, but who we are now.
This seems to be a very hardwired response, that it's something which was useful in our evolutionary environment and still is useful in modern life. But now there are a range of situations which we put ourselves in, which are not threatening, yet the body still responds in the same way.
Simmering away under the surface of all of us is the potential for aggression if we're under threat, or if we think that we're under threat. There is something innately violent in all of us. You can make it illegal for aristocrats to kill peasants, for men to be violent to women, and for adults to beat children. But if you accept that we are basically violent in our natures, there are going to be some situations that bring it all out. We tend to think of the football riots, race riots and gang warfare as the violent face of Britain's modern culture. But the lethal combination of fear and excitement that provoke riots when large crowds of people get together is as old as Britain itself. And you don't have to look very far into our history to see that the British on the rampage are not a modern phenomenon. No, they're traditional.
By the early 1900s, Cardiff was the largest coal exporting city in the world. And it was right here in 1919 that an incident took place as violent as Britain's streets have seen in the last 100 years.
In the second half of the 19th century, sailors from around the world settled here. Quite a few married local white girls, and a multiracial community built up around the docks in Bute Town, an area cut off from the rest of Cardiff. And when the First World War broke out, many more blacks filled the jobs vacated by the men who'd gone off to join the army.
In 1918, huge amounts of Cardiff men came back from the war and found strangers in their town. So tensions started to rise.
The returning soldiers got home to find newcomers in their jobs. Saw strangers married to their local girls. They felt their very livelihoods threatened. And when humans feel threatened, their hardwired caveman instincts towards aggression kick in.
On the evening of Wednesday, the 11th of June, 1919, just here on the edge of Bute Town, a group of black men and their white wives were coming back from a picnic. But they started drawing shouts and catcalls from a group of white guys, and they traded back. But things got nasty, and neither side would back down, and more people were joining in. This was getting unpleasant. Well, it didn't take very long for the violence to start. Fists were flying, rocks were flying, bottles were going into people's faces.
But the whites got more than they had bargained for. The black guys, who'd been enjoying a peaceful picnic with their wives, suddenly found themselves and their families under threat. They had no choice but to retaliate. And what the white mob didn't know was that some of the black guys had guns.
Incidents we can see here, this is the death of Harold Smart on the first night of the riots.
Yeah.
This happened at about the time that the brake was attacked on its way back from the picnic, and Harold Smart was found in Caroline Street, which is just north of Bute Town, with his throat cut.
And he died?
And he died, yes. There were then people bent on revenge. They went down into Bute Town and tried to burn property, beat up people, generally cause destruction.
It got worse. There were more than 5,000 people roaming the streets by now, and they turned north, heading for a hotel in Millicent Street. By this time, the crowd was so huge it filled the whole road. And right here, they stormed the hotel. The blacks inside started shooting, and they shot a white man dead. It was a very big riot. There are hundreds of stories. In another house nearby, the whites broke in and beat a black guy to death.
The fears of the community that the newcomers were taking over had stirred up aggression and violence on both sides. Things were escalating and mob rule was about to take over. The Cardiff riot was going to claim more victims. In 1919, one of the most violent race riots of the 20th century broke out in the Bute Town area of Cardiff. Jobless white men, recently returned from the First World War, battled for days against the area's mainly black population.
Bute Town is very much cut off from the rest of the city, is once described as being like an island. There are only 3 ways into it by road.
So that was the main black area?
That's where most of the black people had lived. Yeah. And that was where they were seen as being acceptable within Cardiff. So it's referred to by that term, Negro land. The problem was that not all the black people lived in Butte Town.
Right.
Many of them had moved out during the war. And in a way, that's what it's about. What seems to be behind the riot is the sense that we'll clear them out of these areas where they shouldn't be living in.
One family who had moved out from Butte Town was James Headley, his wife Agnes, and their 9-year-old daughter. Her son, Neil Sinclair, describes their experiences on the night of Friday, the 13th of June, 1919.
They heard the footsteps of people, many men, running like hundreds of men. And in fact, there was 1,000 white men coming to Somerset Street, knowing that there were 3 black families living on the street. And so my grandmother said to James, "You better go out the back and climb over the wall or get out before they get you." Because they could have lynched him, they could have killed him, they could have beat him severely or whatever. Then the men came up the stairs and hit my grandmother, knocked her down. Then somebody downstairs was saying, "Come on, let's set the house on fire," and they'd thrown petrol over the tablecloth on the little table in the front room. Yeah. But one of the men said, "No, you can't, don't burn the house down, it don't belong to that black bastard anyway, you know? The house belonged to somebody they knew, so they didn't want to burn it down." And then they left, and so my mother and her mother came down the stairs to see the house was totally wrecked, all the little china ornaments ruined, and she'd made a cosy little home for them, and it was all smashed to pieces. A day after the incident, of course, the police came, and they looked at the damage and everything like that, and they said to Agnes, "Well, it was her fault for marrying a black man anyway. What you going to do that for?"
After 4 whole days of violence, hundreds of people have been injured. Huge amounts of property have been destroyed, and at least 4 people were lying dead. The riots finally faded out on Saturday, the 14th of June. And by August 1919, more than 500 members of the black community had been repatriated to the West Indies. Even as little as 500 years ago, our laws actively encouraged violence. But now we organise ourselves through the rational rule of law. Deep inside, we Britons are still capable of being violent. So the next time you think violence is the answer to your problems, think twice, because the person you pick on might be better at it than you.